Good day. Today is Monday, 22nd September 2025, and of course I am back in London doing programs here in my library, and I expect to be doing those for the next couple of weeks at the very least, so you can get accustomed once again to seeing me in my usual location. In the meantime, I would like to say a very few things about the event I attended in Chicago, and just to say that Integrity Media is a group that has brought together various people in the United States, notably in the city of Chicago, who are interested in free speech issues, who want to support those who are concerned about true independence in media and true integrity in media. And I should say that people who are involved in setting up this group include people like Leonard Goodman and Patrick Sullivan, lawyers, one a criminal defense lawyer, very prominent criminal defense lawyer, the other a corporate lawyer, but they are people from the legal side of the various professions. There were other people from other places, and they basically support this initiative to support independent voices in media. And I should say independent voices from the libertarian right, extending to the old left, including voices like the Duran and myself, which is why I received the invitation. And I ought to say that, in my opinion, this initiative is not only welcome, but it is overdue. There are lots of us, or at least maybe not that many actually, but there are those of us who are out there trying to promote programs and discuss things and talk about them in places like this channel and as Alex and I do on the Duran. But we have long lacked a platform or a venue where we can all meet and talk with each other and exchange ideas and exchange thoughts. And finally, someone generously is coming forward to do precisely that. And I think that that is going to inspire much more confidence amongst those who are involved in the kind of work that I and others do. And it will give us not just confidence, because it will bring us together. And as I said, there's always confidence that comes from being in company. But also I am confident also that it will improve the quality of our work, give us a greater depth and understanding of each other, and make us all work better at what we do. So that's what I want to say about Integrity Media in this program. Obviously, this program will be dedicated to geopolitical questions, so I'm going to try and say more, perhaps, in future programs. But I would like to thank, first of all, the organisers for their generosity and the time and effort that they gave to it, and also for doing something which, as I said, I think is invaluable and in itself is long overdue. So let me now turn to the topics that I intend to discuss today. And I'm going to discuss in this program mostly, again, issues concerning Ukraine and Ukraine-related issues. But perhaps when I say that, it's perhaps worth taking a step back and recognizing again that though the armed part of the conflict is taking place in Ukraine, the way this conflict has evolved is that it has now become a test of strength between Russia and the West, one in which, I think to the amazement of most people around the world, Russia is prevailing. But it is also, of course, a test and a catalyst of the new system of international relations, of the new economic and social changes that are taking place around the world, of the great rebalancing of power and influence, economic power and political power, but also, of course, military power, which is also taking place around the world and which is reshaping it and which will make the world a very different place from the Western Atlantic-dominated world that all of us who have lived over the last 80 years since the end of the Second World War are accustomed to. So it's important always to understand this about this conflict. Obviously, the fighting, the deaths, the tragedies are playing out on the battlefields east of the Dnieper. The economic, social challenges are most acute in Ukraine. But this is a wider conflict, a much bigger conflict than just that. And it is being fought and won and lost at many, many different levels: diplomatic, economic, social, in the minds of people around the world. And that process continues every day. Now, I say that, and I want to say that one of the major factors in this conflict, one of the things that is playing out through this conflict, is what is, to my mind, starting to look like a long-term fracture within what the Russians have named the collective West. The West as a political and military and economic unity basically emerged after the Second World War and consolidated during the Cold War. And throughout the time of its existence, there's been endless comments and claims and predictions that there would be splits within the West, and the Soviets and then the Russians were often accused of seeking to foment these splits. But these splits have never really happened, and the reality for most of this period of 80 years, since the end of the Second World War, is that the Western system, the Western alliance if you prefer, has held together very well. But over the last 3.5 years, and I would argue especially over the last 2, the strains have begun to show, and they're getting greater and greater all the time, and they're becoming wider. And these strains are explicable from one very simple fact. The single most powerful country in the West remains the United States. It continues to be a global superpower. It accounts for around half the West's GDP, perhaps even more than that, and for a disproportionate share of the West's military power. The United States, as a global superpower, has global interests. It has a massive footprint, for example, in Latin America, in the Western Hemisphere, which it has historically always regarded as its specific sphere of influence, but it is involved in many places around the world, in the Middle East, in East Asia, in all sorts of places. And what it is now confronted by is an emerging alliance system, the alliance system of China and Russia and their various friends, and the BRICS states and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which for the first time since the end of the Second World War surpasses the United States itself in economic and potentially military power. This is a situation that the United States has never previously confronted, and which is an enormous challenge for it. And inevitably, this means that the United States has to prioritize. It has to prioritize where the still immense weight of power that it still has should be brought to bear, where it should focus and where it should not. By contrast, the West, or rather the European parts of this alliance, are narrowly focused on what happens in Europe. They cannot share the same global perspective that the United States does, even if they sometimes pretend to. They may send token contingents. For example, the odd ship in Britain, one of Britain's largely unusable aircraft carriers, to the Asia Pacific. But nobody seriously believes that they can make a genuine contribution in that area. And of course, their interests lie elsewhere. Their interests lie specifically in their own region. And since they are focused on their own region, they are mostly focused on the great adversary power to the West, which is located in that region, which is, of course, Russia. And the United States cannot be focused on Russia in quite the same way. And that is the big difference between the two parts of the West. And a recent article, an article that has just come out in Reuters, highlights this tension and shows how the splits are starting to develop, and it also, in my opinion, explains further many recent events. So it appears that in late August, officials from the Pentagon met with officials from Europe. This was essentially a secret meeting. Reuters has only disclosed now, for the first time, that it actually took place. And what it tells us about this meeting shows that it was a very tense meeting, that the meeting did not go well, and that there was no harmony between the participants. Because the Americans, the Pentagon, tried to explain to the Europeans the points that I've just been making in this program, that the United States has global interests but finite resources. It cannot be simultaneously strong everywhere. And its major adversary today, its peer competitor, is China, not Russia. It is China that is conducting the most active challenge to the United States in the Asia Pacific. And in addition, and beyond that, Russia, though a substantial power, being weaker than China, the US interest arguably is to seek to come to some kind of understanding with it, if only to pull it further away from China than it is now. And the Americans explained that given that this is so, American focus henceforth must be in securing its own homeland and its own sphere of influence, the Western Hemisphere, the United States, North America, Latin America, and that the United States, therefore, is in less of a position to continue to provide military and economic support, geopolitical support to Europe and to the United States' NATO allies. And in particular, the United States is reversing certain decisions made during the Biden administration. The Biden administration, as I well remember, significantly upgraded US military involvement and investment in the defences of certain East European states, and in particular those states clustered around the Baltic. Whereas now, the United States has come to understand that doing this overstretches its capabilities, and that commitment, therefore, is going to be reduced. Now, this is absolutely not what the Europeans, obsessed as they are with their conflict with Russia, wanted to hear. And I think that this article in Reuters now provides the full explanation for these rather strange events that have been taking place over the last couple of weeks. The incident with the drones, the Russian drones, that entered Polish airspace. Having read this article in Reuters, I'm going to express my own opinion now, which differs from the opinion I expressed about a week ago. At that time, I thought that this was probably most likely a technical fault. After reading this article in Reuters, I have come round to the view, expressed by many others, that more likely this was actually a staged event, staged perhaps by certain of the NATO states in cooperation with Ukraine, patching together Russian drones, Gerberow drones that had fallen on Ukrainian territory, and then sending them across the border into Poland in order to create a narrative of the Russians testing Polish and NATO defences. I never ruled out that possibility, but I've now come round to the view that it is the most plausible one. And of course, we've had the story of the Romanian drone, and we have also had the story that I discussed 2 days ago, the story about the MiG-31 fighter jets, which were traveling from one Russian airbase in Karelia to another Russian airbase in Kaliningrad and crossed the Baltic Sea, but which the Estonians and other NATO countries claimed, without ever providing any concrete proof, that this trio of MiG-31 fighter jets had supposedly trespassed into Estonian airspace and had flown over a deserted rock 26 kilometers north of the Estonian coastline. And, there's been other incidents since then. The German Air Force has supposedly responded to operations over the Baltic by a Russian Ilyushin-20 reconnaissance aircraft. I've not seen claims that this aircraft actually did enter the airspace of any of the NATO powers. And of course, it's worth saying that the NATO powers also operate reconnaissance aircraft over the Baltic, and they do so constantly and all the time. But again, one can see how this narrative builds on all of the various other incidents that we have been talking about. And of course, both Poland and Estonia have now invoked Article 4 of the Washington Treaty, the founding treaty of NATO, to seek consultations about these supposed Russian encroachments on their airspace, and there are going to be consultations amongst the NATO member states, and I understand that a meeting between the various NATO states, which will of course include the United States, is expected to take place tomorrow. And over the last couple of days, since these incidents began, we have had an enormous chorus of claims repeated across the media, repeated by Western officials, European officials, that this is all further proof of Russian aggressiveness, that the Russians are testing Europe's defences, NATO's defences, that they are planning some dark acts of aggression at some point before very long. And for that reason, the United States needs to forget about all of the other problems that it contends with around the world, in the Middle East, in Latin America, in East Asia, problems which, just to say, I accept and believe mostly are created by the United States itself. But, let's not get distracted by that. But anyway, the United States is supposed to forget all about that. It's supposed to put aside all its concerns about the fact that its inventories have been depleted, the fact that it no longer is able to match demands for Patriot missile interceptors from Ukraine, let alone from other allies. It's supposed to recommit itself aggressively to the cause of Ukraine, to the cause of defending Europe from the Russian bear. And, well, this is what this meeting tomorrow is going to be all about. And, of course, it is the reason why we have had all of these incidents. These incidents, in my opinion, have been staged or used precisely in order to construct this narrative, in order to get the Americans to swing round and to forget about all of their other problems and concerns and to focus exclusively and entirely on Europe. It's on Europe and on Europe basically alone. And, well, the Europeans do have their allies in the United States who are supporting them in this endeavour. I noticed that over the last couple of days, we've seen an awful lot more of General Kellogg, President Trump's peace envoy, except he hasn't promoted peace. He's promoted an idea for freezing the conflict. Anyway, we've seen an awful lot more of him than we had been doing for several weeks. Anyway, he turned up in Kiev. He's been giving interviews. He's been speaking quite a lot. He's talked about how Russia is weak, how its military is weak, how it is suffering these colossal losses, how it is failing to win the war, how, in fact, all the United States needs to do is to exert itself just a little bit more than it has up to now. And, of course, if there was an armed clash between Russia and the United States, it would be game over immediately, because the United States supposedly is so much stronger than Russia is that the Americans would, well, I'm not going to repeat General Kellogg's words, but they would sweep the board with the Russians in no time. And the same story, the same narrative, has now been promoted by the outgoing head of MI6, Britain's foreign intelligence agency. He's now given basically a retirement interview to, I believe it was the Daily Telegraph. Russia is a weak, declining power. The Russians have bitten off more than they can chew in Ukraine. It is not true that they are actually winning in Ukraine. On the contrary, the war in Ukraine is draining their power even faster than it was already draining. All the West has to do is harden its position, tighten up the sanctions, and at best, the Russians will be forced to capitulate and come to terms on the basis of Western, Ukrainian, and of course, ultimately, American demands. And at worst, or perhaps actually at best, there would be a massive crisis in Russia, and the basic point made is that there would be a governmental crisis, and President Putin would fall. And we also have similar comments now being made by Robert Kagan, the high priest, as I call him, of the Neocons, the husband of Victoria Nuland. He's published a long article in The Atlantic. Kagan is many things, but amongst them, it must be said straight away that he is an intelligent man, and he is sometimes rather more frank in expressing himself than some other European officials or leaders are. For instance, though he of course takes it as read that the Russians were indeed the people who were behind the encroachments, the drone encroachment on Poland and the flights of the MiG-31s and all of that, he makes the really surprising admission, I say surprising from a Western point of view, that the Russians, from the perspective of international law, actually might have right on their side. Because, as Kagan admits, it has been long understood that one country arming another country in order to fight a third country in the midst of a war makes the first country a co-belligerent in that war. So all of these weapons supplies, all of these armaments that the Western powers are sending to Ukraine means that they cannot pretend that they're not involved in the war between Ukraine and Russia. They are involved in that war, deeply involved in that war, and this does actually provide the Russians with a legitimate legal justification for taking military action against them. As Kagan obviously and undoubtedly knows, that he doesn't actually say and explore in the same article in The Atlantic. In fact, it goes much further than mere arms supplies. The West hasn't merely supplied arms to the Ukrainians, it's provided the Ukrainians with training, it's provided the Ukrainians with intelligence, it has assisted through technicians and other people of that kind with the operation of Ukrainian weapons. It has drawn up battle plans for the Ukrainian army. It has effectively run the Ukrainian army. It has practically commanded the Ukrainian army in various military operations, such as the 2023 summer offensive that the Ukrainians launched, and the Battle of Krinky, and other operations of that kind. So, Kagan is absolutely right in saying that, legally speaking, the Russians are fully entitled to treat the Western powers, the NATO powers, that have operated, that have done all of these things as co-belligerents. I would go further. I would personally say that the economic war that the West has relentlessly waged against Russia since February 2022, and arguably before that, since June 2014, is also an act of military belligerence, such as certainly in the past would have justified an armed attack. So, to give one example, freezing the assets of the Russian central bank would certainly, once upon a time, and not that long ago, within my lifetime, have been treated as an act of war. And confiscating those assets, something which the European Union is now in effect proposing, would certainly have been treated as an act of war. I remember how, roughly a year ago, there was an article in the Financial Times which strongly counselled against any such step any step of that kind, precisely because it would be an act of war, and as such, as that article correctly said, would blur the difference, dangerously blur the difference between war and peace. So Kagan, I think, is definitely right. The Russians have every legal right to take countermeasures against the Western powers, and I suspect, as Kagan says, that those countermeasures could extend to military action. And of course, to repeat a point the Russians have themselves made, it's hardly disputed that the Western powers have facilitated Ukrainian attacks on Russian territory, including Russian territory which the Western powers themselves recognize as Russian. We're talking about the ATACMS strikes in Kursk region, the Storm Shadow strikes in Kursk region, the assistance provided to the Ukrainian drone strikes on Russian targets deep inside Russia. In other times, in earlier historical periods, all of these steps would have been considered acts of war, and the Russians could have reacted accordingly. So Kagan says that, and then he says this. He said that these Russian encroachments, these tests, as he calls them, of Western defences in Poland, the Baltic states, elsewhere, are a key point, because the Russians arguably have legal justification to do what they are doing, and if no action is taken against them, they could do a lot more. And therefore the right thing to do is not to stop doing all of these aggressive things, which have brought us to this point where there is now potentially a crisis in the Baltic and in northeast Europe. It is, on the contrary, to escalate, to actually go from this period of shadow war further, to start shooting Russian planes down over the Baltic Sea and in Eastern Europe, if they do in fact cross into Eastern Europe, and in fact to risk all-out war with the Russians. Kagan basically discounts any possibility that such a war might go nuclear. And like General Kellogg, he is confident that if the West were to do these things, well, the Russian army is so weak, it's so disorganized, it's so inefficient, it's so corrupt and backward and technologically inept that the West would quickly win a quick victory. I read all of this and I'm always astonished that people make these facile and obviously wrong claims about Russian military capabilities, claims which, to my knowledge, many people in the militaries in Europe emphatically do not share, and nor do the wider populations. And I also have to say that this complacent discounting of the threat of nuclear war from these kind of moves strikes me as incredibly reckless. But anyway, one can see what these people are all trying to do. They are again trying to tell the United States, the President of the United States, his administration, that, look, if you do concentrate all your resources on crushing the Russians, which is what you should do, then don't worry, because it will be easy. The Russians are not strong. They're really weak. Even as they're supposed to be threatening the whole of Europe, they're actually very, very weak. This is the moment. This is the time to do it. If we don't do it now, the Russians will get bolder and we will invite more problems. But if we take that step now, then we can win, and we can win fast. And obviously, this is partly a product of the slow motion collapse of the Ukrainian army in Ukraine and the growing worries and fears across Europe about that. But it is also a message to the United States that you both can and you should focus all your energies, all your resources on Europe. You should forget about all of the other places, because if you do, you will win, and you will win easily, and you will win fast. It has been an iron law of neocon advice that they always discount the ability of their adversaries to resist them, and they always massively overstate the ease with which they believe the United States can win. This is true, by the way, of the current crisis between the West and Russia. I've never forgotten again the Munich Security Conference of February 2022, the sense of euphoria that seemed to grip everybody who was participating in it at that time, their absolute conviction, their intoxicated belief that if they pushed just a little, the Russian colossus would collapse, that the Russian colossus was a colossus with feet of clay, just freezing a few central bank assets there, disconnecting Russian banks from SWIFT. All of that would be enough, and it would all come tumbling down. Well, today they're telling us the same story all over again, and then only they're now saying that despite all the evidence of the last 3.5 years, the Russians are weak militarily. They can't stand up to us. All we need to do is to take a strong line in the Baltic, and the Russians will collapse there as well. Now, there is particular interest and focus in the Baltic because it's quite clear to me and obvious to me, and in fact the Russians have talked about it. Putin's former national security advisor, Nikolai Patrushev, has discussed this extensively, and it was also commented upon by other Russian officials. Anyway, it's quite clear to me, it was quite clear to me in the late summer of this year that a plan was being hatched within NATO to impose a sea blockade of the Russian coast in the Baltic. The assumption was that the Baltic, being a relatively enclosed sea with the key access points easy to close for NATO, that the NATO powers would have no difficulty closing the Baltic Sea to Russian shipping. A disproportionate, but a large proportion of Russia's exports pass through the Baltic Sea, including energy exports of petroleum and gas and that kind of liquefied natural gas and things like that. And that these plans to close the Baltic to Russian shipping were becoming fairly well advanced. And clearly these plans also had some support from the United States. I remember that General Cavalli of the United States, Colonel Cavoli I should say, of the United States was even bragging about how straightforward it would be for the United States to occupy the entire region of Kaliningrad on the Baltic. So all of these plans were developing and were being hatched. And I remember that Patrushev was talking about the Russians having to use their fleet to escort merchant ships through the Black Sea, through the Baltic Sea, and through the North Atlantic, the English Channel. In fact, there were examples of Russian warships doing exactly this. And it all seemed to be pointing towards a major showdown in the Baltic. And then, to the dismay of all of the NATO states, along come the Americans at the end of August, and they tell the Europeans, actually, we're not going to take any kind of action in the Baltic. After all, we're not going to risk getting tangled up in a confrontation with the Russians in the Baltic. We're going to start actually reducing our physical presence there and our military support to you. And this must have provoked deep dismay. And, well, it was followed shortly after by further information from the Pentagon that the United States was stopping further Patriot missile deliveries to Europe because of the shortage of Patriot missiles within its own inventories. And I think that this was the trigger to the events of the last couple of days. The drone incursion, I should say the two drone incursions, the incident with the MiG-31s, the invocations of Article 4, alarm that the Americans, far from increasing their aggressiveness and being confrontational with the Russians in the Baltic, seem to be pulling back, that the Russians, far from being eager to take the Americans, far from being eager to take the Russians on, to walk into Kaliningrad, a cakewalk, if you believe General Cavoli, or to take them on in the Baltic and to shoot down their aircraft and take over seize their ships and do any of those sort of things, that the Americans are pulling back from doing any of these things. And so, of course, you have to set up the narrative that, in fact, the reality is that the Russians are weak, that they're losing the war in Ukraine, that their army is useless, that their air force is useless, and why aren't the Americans doubling down? Why aren't they imposing these sea and air blockades? And that's why, as I said, these extraordinary events have taken place. Now, for the moment, the US, at least the President of the United States and the administration, seem to be sticking to their positions. There's been attempts to goad the President into making all kinds of commitments to rush to the defense of the East European states and of the Baltic states, to escalate, in other words, in the Baltic. But he has avoided making any really belligerent comments until now. When he was asked yesterday whether the United States would defend Poland, he said yes, but he did so without giving the impression that he thought that that would need to be done anytime soon. He certainly didn't come across as if he believed that the United States was on the brink of some great military crisis, like the Cuban Missile Crisis, going head-to-head with the Russians in that kind of way. So for the moment, at least, the Americans are remaining level-headed about all of this. and they appear to be aware of what their so-called friends in Europe are ultimately about. But, of course, one can never be completely sure. Some of the military people in the Pentagon, General Cavoli, General Kellogg, of course he's retired, but he's still a general, he's contacts there. General Kane, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, they all do seem to be, if not perhaps spoiling for a fight, at least ready for one. And one can't be certain that this relative period of restraint is going to hold. I expect that it will. But if I were to say that I was absolutely sure, then I would be saying more than I know. But that, it seems to me, is the story that is playing out at the moment in Europe. Now, in the meantime, President Zelensky has been busy, and as I discussed in my program yesterday, he is preparing to travel to the United States to attend the General Assembly session and to meet with President Trump. Now, lots of rumors have been circulating about that speech that he made to Ukrainian MPs a couple of days ago. And the website, the interesting, very good website, Events in Ukraine, has discussed these rumors extensively. And there are reports about what Zelensky said coming from some of the MPs, the Ukrainian MPs who were there, and from other MPs who were not actually physically there, but who appear to have heard reports about what Zelensky said from other MPs who were indeed there. And I think we can begin to piece together some of the things that Zelensky said. Firstly, he did recognize a military crisis on the battlefronts. I've discussed already that, in my opinion, the event that is concerning him most is the situation in the town of Pakrovsk, that the situation there is much worse than the Ukrainian authorities are admitting to. Pakrovsk is the single most strategically important point on the battlefronts, a sign of how worried Zelensky is about the situation in Pakrovsk is that he visited that area himself and met Ukrainian commanders and officials in the nearby town of Dobropilya. I noticed, by the way, that he did not travel to Pakrovsk itself. Usually when a place is under siege or close to coming under siege, Zelensky visits it. He's been to places like Bakhmut and Rabotino and other places which were being attacked and eventually captured by the Russians. But he visited those places sometime before their fall. He didn't this time go to Pakrovsk, which again reinforces my view that the position of the Ukrainians in that town is even more threatening than most commentators understand. But anyway, Zelensky admitted to the MPs, far from all of whom were there, by the way, that the situation is becoming critical and looks likely to deteriorate. But what all of the commentaries say, commentaries that range from Strana, the very informative Ukrainian news site, which now has to publish outside Ukraine, to other commentaries appearing on the nationalist side of the Ukrainian political scene. What they all say is that Zelensky, when he admitted that the situation was becoming critical, and went on to say that critical decisions might have to be made, excluded any suggestion of peace moves towards the Russians or compromises on any substantive issues towards the Russians. In fact, much of his speech appears to have been a criticism of Ukrainian officials who were advising, or Ukrainian political figures who apparently have been advising that very thing. What he was hinting at, nobody quite knows. Well, what he was hinting at when he was talking about critical decisions, nobody quite knows. But perhaps I'm reading more into the very intelligent and well-informed commentary by Events in Ukraine, the blog site, the news site I've been speaking about. But I gained the impression that the author, who is not known to me, by the way, believes that what Zelensky is most likely to do, if Pokrovsk and other important places start to fall, is lower the conscription age. Now, recently, Zelensky relaxed controls on the border. He's now allowing young men aged between 18 and 22 to leave Ukraine. This has provoked some concern both in the West and within the more hardline faction, nationalist faction in Ukraine itself. They're alarmed by the fact that many of these young men between 18 and 22, student-age men, have seized the advantage to leave Ukraine without perhaps showing much inclination to return. And this has exasperated and annoyed many of these people because, of course, they yearn to enlist these same young men and to throw them into the battle. But my take on the article in Events in Ukraine is that the author believes that the reason Zelensky took that step to let the young men aged between 18 and 22 leave Ukraine is because he now intends to conscript the young men aged between 23 and 25 who perhaps are a bigger cohort and one which is less likely to protest because most of these people will be in employment, whereas the younger men, many of them, will probably be students. So I think that is right. I think that as soon as Pokrovsk falls, as soon as some of these other places fall, we will see Zelensky announce more draconian steps to control the political situation in Ukraine, to tighten his control over the political situation in Ukraine, and he's going to announce a further reduction in the conscription age and initiate more steps towards bolstering the Ukrainian armed forces by rounding up young men, some of them, of course, still very young in their early 20s, and throwing them into the battle. Now, if that is correct, then this is a tragedy for Ukraine and for its people, obviously. It is a tragedy for the young men in question. I've seen a multiplicity of reports on various Telegram channels, mostly, I will say this, Russian Telegram channels, about the very short life expectancy of recently mobilized Ukrainian soldiers who are thrown into the battle. It can sometimes be limited, according to these sources, to just a few days, but it doesn't surprise me. it is, in fact, exactly what I would expect Zelensky to do. I don't believe that he will ever negotiate and that he will ever compromise. I think even if the Russians reach the outskirts of Kiev again, which is quite plausible, I still think he will refuse substantive negotiations. My own view is that if he senses that Kiev is about to fall, he will probably leave with the government and relocate west, perhaps to the city of Lvov, though maybe even to other places like Zhytomyr or Vinnytsia, and he will try to maintain the war from there. And if there is eventually a total collapse, he will still refuse to negotiate, and he will go to the west and he will set up a government in exile there, and he will try to keep the conflict going from there, and he will continue to insist that he is the legitimate president of Ukraine, and he will continue to demand Western and in particular European support and further funds to be provided to him. But that is my own view of what Zelensky intends to do. And I think that these MPs who are reporting an increasingly pessimistic Zelensky about the military situation, but also an increasingly defiant Zelensky, are absolutely right. Now, this article in events in Ukraine also confirmed something which I'd sort of noticed myself. This is that the Ukrainian parliament is dying. I don't mean literally, but as an institution, it is fading away. The number of MPs who turn up for sessions, who participate in parliamentary sessions, seems to be in continuous decline. The parliament has been largely sidelined by Zelensky, who doesn't appear to take it very seriously. He barely meets with the MPs now, and he addresses it. Well, I think the last time he addressed it was at the end of last year. And fewer MPs are turning up, and quite often there's insufficient MPs to form a quorum. And I think Zelensky wants it this way, because after all, his great enemy and adversary, President Putin of Russia, was casting doubt on Zelensky's legitimacy as president, has continued to insist that the Ukrainian parliament is legitimate, and has implied that the Speaker of the Parliament is the one legitimate authority left in Ukraine, not Zelensky himself. So I think that Zelensky sees the Parliament as a potentially dangerous alternative power centre. And I think he worries that when the Russians speak about the Parliament as a potential alternative to himself, that they might be serious about that. I suspect that at the back of Zelensky's mind, and some of the officials who are advising him, there's probably also dark memories of what happened in February 2014 at the time of the Maidan events. President Yanukovych of Ukraine fled Ukraine when the Maidan protesters, I'm speaking very carefully now, basically seized physical control of the center of Kiev. Now, up to that time, the parliament, the Ukrainian parliament, the Rada, was dominated by Yanukovych's party, the Party of the Regions. It had a clear majority in the Rada. But as soon as those events of February 2014 took place, as soon as Yanukovych fled, the MPs in the Party of the Regions defected from Yanukovych en masse. And though it's debatable whether they had any legal authority to do it, they essentially declared Yanukovych ousted. They didn't go through an impeachment process or anything of that kind, but they declared Yanukovych ousted, and they proceeded to legitimize or pretend to legitimize the takeover of power by the Maidan movement, and supported not just the appointment of interim leaders drawn from the Maidan movement, but also legislation that the Maidan movement had insisted upon. So Zelensky doubtless remembers how during the February 2014 crisis, the parliament shifted completely from loyalty to one figure, Yanukovych, to loyalty to a completely opposite and contrary figure, Yanukovych's political enemies in the Maidan movement. And I suspect that he feels that something similar might happen to him too in the event of a crisis. And for that reason, he is happy to let the parliament wither away. Now, what that means is that political activity in Ukraine is not only hugely confined, but it's become threadbare. The parliament barely functions. The courts, as far as I can see, barely function. The constitutional court lacks a quorum and cannot meet. I'm not even sure whether it has any members. All that is left is Zelensky himself, and he basically governs the country by decree, and that is the way I think Zelensky likes it. Many people in the West, I think, are blind to these realities still to this day. But of course, the absence of an effective parliament, a functioning parliament, makes it even more difficult to challenge Zelensky and to hold him to account for the decisions that he is making. And personally, I don't believe that there are any forces, political forces in Ukraine at the present time, which are strong enough to get rid of him. So there it is. Attempts by the Europeans to foster a crisis in the Baltic, to get the United States back involved. The Americans deeply skeptical, and Zelensky, far from seeking to end the war, determined instead to keep it going, to keep fighting, and to keep fighting to the bitterest end. Bitter for the people of Ukraine, that is. Now, here I'm going to make a further, perhaps rather troubling point. As I have discussed in many programs, I have a source who has access to some of the messaging boards in the Duma, which are practically open source information. There's apparently very little done in order to restrict them. Anyway, this source has told me that for some time now, a certain current of opinion has existed in the Duma, which is expressed on these messaging boards and which is beginning perhaps to gain traction, that a 2 to 3 year war in Ukraine is optimal for Russia. The reason is that not only will that result in a complete Russian victory across the entire territory of Ukraine, but that the war, the special military operation, is enabling the rebuilding of Russia. That the factors of Russian power and Russian strength that had upheld the former Soviet superpower, the country's massive industrial base, its massive manufacturing capability, the various planning mechanisms that were created during the Soviet times to operate that industrial and manufacturing base effectively, the technological and science and higher education base that also supported all of the rest, and the sentiments of the people and the entire mood amongst the people and the whole character of the Russian economy are being reconstructed because of the war in ways that it might have been impossible to do if the peace which had existed prior to February 2022 had indefinitely continued. And this is something perhaps that people in the West, those who demand further sanctions, don't perhaps fully appreciate or understand. Now, I don't think that these ideas about a long war, Russia benefiting from a long war, gaining greater self-sufficiency, gaining greater economic power, industrializing, reindustrializing, and become more technologically advanced, and also redefining itself politically as a more patriotic, nationalistic country. I don't think many people, I think there are many people, or at least some people, in Russia who still don't share those beliefs. I think that President Putin himself, for example, probably doesn't share them. I think that there are other people within the Russian government, people like, for example, the chairman of the Russian Central Bank, Elvira Nabiullina, and people like that, who don't share them either. But I am sure that this message, coming from the messaging boards, is probably true, because I have seen evidence of this rise in sentiment myself, and it's appearing in the more publicly available publications in Russia itself. So, coming back to these ideas about imposing further sanctions on Russia, or of prolonging the war against Russia, or of abandoning all attempts to negotiate and to seek a compromise with Russia. The thing to understand is that there are people in Russia itself who welcome that very thing because it enables them to recreate Russia in the way that they want, and which, by the way, they believe is closer to Russian interests and Russian traditions. And of course, what that means is that at the end of the conflict, if the conflict is prolonged in the way that some people in the West want it to be, what the West will find is that all of the claims about Putin wanting to recreate the Soviet Union, or at least aspects of the Soviet Union, are indeed going to come true, but more as a product of Western actions than as a result of Putin's intentions. Putin wanted to negotiate peace at the start of the war. That was why he sent a team of negotiators to meet with Zelensky's negotiators on the second day of the war. That was why he announced a ceasefire on the second day of the war, though in fact it only lasted for one day. That is why the negotiations continued for weeks in Belarus and then in Istanbul, and why Putin ordered the troops to withdraw from Kiev after the Istanbul agreement was initialed. But with every day that the war continues, Putin's wish for a negotiated solution gradually fades in Russia itself, and those who want to take a harder line grow stronger. Now, Putin recently visited the city of Perm, a Russian city, by the way, which I happen to know. I've visited Perm. I visited many of the facilities there, and I visited, this is some years back actually, the university there, and met some of the academics and some of the students there. So it's a city that I have some familiarity with. But anyway, Perm is also a center of the Russian aerospace industry. It is where a whole new range of aircraft engines is being developed, and apparently there is a major project to massively expand the factory that builds those aircraft engines in Perm. But I noticed that he also visited Russia's most important factory producing artillery pieces in Perm, and he met the various people there, and he discussed with them Russia's progress in producing more heavy artillery pieces. Now, I also noticed that there was another Russian official who was accompanying him during that visit, and who I've noticed is gaining more prominence in Russia. And this is Alexei Dumin, former military official, a person who served in the military, who has strong connections with Russia's special forces, and who now works within the executive office, the secretariat at the heart of Russia's government structure. And it seems to me that Dumin is gaining in more prominence all the time. And if you want to talk about a potential successor who might indeed favour the kind of hardline policies that I've just been talking about, a prolonged war so as to remake Russia in the way that those people in the messaging boards are suggesting, well, I would not be surprised if Dumin is exactly the sort of person who might hold those views. Now, to repeat again, I don't believe myself that Putin himself does. Yesterday, he chaired another meeting of the Russian Security Council, very interesting meeting, and much of that meeting was devoted to a discussion of migration policy. We were not provided with much text of this. But the Kremlin has republished Putin's introductory words, which eerily echoed my own concerns about the fact that the START treaty is due to end in February 2026, and that there will be no system of arms control beyond it. And Putin expressed serious concern about this. He said the new START treaty expires on February 5th, 2026, marking the imminent demise of the last international agreement directly limiting nuclear missile capabilities. Completely abandoning the legacy of this agreement would be, from many perspectives, a mistaken and short-sighted step, which, in our view, would also negatively impact the goals of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. It's almost as if Putin had been listening to what I had been saying in my previous program and is now repeating them, except, of course, that is not true, because the meeting also happened yesterday, and he is saying the same thing as I said in my own program. To avoid provoking a further strategic arms race, and to ensure an acceptable level of predictability and restraint, we believe it is justified to attempt to maintain the status quo established by the START Treaty during the current, rather turbulent period. Therefore, Russia is prepared to continue adhering to the central quantitative limitations of the START Treaty for 1 year after February 5th, 2026. Based on our analysis of the situation, we will subsequently make a decision on maintaining these voluntary self-restraints. We believe this measure will only be viable if the United States follows suit and does not take steps that undermine or disrupt the existing balance of deterrence potential. So Putin is also expressing his alarm about the imminent collapse of the entire system of strategic arms limitation. And he's calling on the Americans to agree with the Russians at least a 1-year extension to the START Treaty. But he also says that this is conditional. If the Americans don't do that, then the Russians will feel that they have no alternative but to start developing, to continue to develop and expand their nuclear forces, even though they fully understand the risks that if that happens, the entire strategic arms treaty will collapse. So Putin is still worried about strategic arms, about the risks to the future of the strategic arms treaty, the risks of arms control. I think people in the West are alarmingly complacent about this issue. And one must not assume that others within the Russian leadership, and I'm not naming any names because, for example, I don't know what Dumin's opinions on this question are, but one must not assume that others in the Russian leadership or other potential future leaders in Russia share the concerns on these matters that Putin himself does. The door for finding some kind of strategic compromise with the Russians is closing, just of course as it is closing in terms of the conflict in Ukraine itself. Now, I'm going to quickly and very briefly say that the military trends on the battlefields continue exactly as I've discussed in previous programs. There's been less information about what is going on in Pokrovsk over the last 24 hours, but it's clear that the Ukrainian counterattacks northeast of Pokrovsk, at least it's clear to me that the Ukrainian counterattacks northeast of Mercouris have run out of steam and that the Russians have managed to hold on to their positions. I saw plenty of evidence of very heavy shelling and bombing by the Russians of Ukrainian positions in Mirnograd, the eastern suburb of Pokrovsk, and I suspect that a storming operation is already underway there. And elsewhere, on the Zaporozhye front, it seems to me that the crisis for the Ukrainians continues to get worse. There are more reports this morning of further Russian advances in the Zaporozhye area, of the Russians capturing more positions around the important fortified center of Novopavlivka, and of the Russians south of Zaporozhye continuing to gain ground as well. And there are lots of reports of further Russian advances in the Siversk area. Most of the video footage we're getting from the war now appears to come from the Siversk area, suggesting that this is, for the Russians at least, an area of priority. And of further Russian advances in the Liman area as well. And lastly, I should say that there appears to have been a reactivation of Russian military moves in the Kharkiv region the Russians have now securely hold all of northern Volchansk, north of the Volga River. They have apparently captured the entire industrial regions of Volchansk, south of the Volga River. There are a number of residential areas of what you might call Greater Volchansk still under Ukrainian control, south of the Volga River. But the Russians appear to be clearing them steadily, one by one. So I think this battle definitely is in its final stages, and I get the sense that Ukrainian resistance there is also running down. But to repeat again, the Russians are clearly winning the war in Ukraine. Kellogg and Co. might be pretending otherwise, but as far as I am concerned, the facts speak for themselves, and all the indications are that far from being afraid of sanctions or afraid of Western intervention, the Russian mood, the increasing mood in Moscow is bring it on. And the United States must also contend with the fact that some of its allies in Europe, the Baltic states, Poland, Germany, they might at the same time be looking for ways to try to involve the United States in the conflict as well. There are some people who have occasional glimmers of sense about what is going on. President Macron of France unusually has come out and said that confiscating, whether directly or through some subterfuge, the Russian assets would be a serious mistake. He said it would undermine Europe's credibility. He is right, but then he's often said things that are right, and then he reverses himself and he endorses what the European hardliners seek to do. On Unheard, the British centre-left newspaper, there is a fascinating article by Wolfgang Munchau, who is rapidly evolving into one of the sane voices in the European media. And the article, the title of the article says it all. Europe's reckless warmongering. We have underestimated Russia. And then he talks about how European leaders still seem unable to grapple with the realities. He said the biggest misunderstanding of all was that Russia's economy was weak and would ultimately buckle under Western pressure. The misjudgment had several layers. It started off with a statistical lie that Russia was really only a small economy. And then he discusses the grounds for this, I think, frankly, bizarre belief. He makes the point that on the basis of purchasing power parity, Russia has the biggest economy in Europe. I think even that actually understates the difference. He then talks about Russia's success in sustaining both its economy and the war. And he also points to the exceptional dependence that the Western powers, the Europeans, have had on the Americans. I'm emphasizing these economic facts because this is what will inform the reality on the ground in Ukraine going forward. It is money that buys weapons. This money for Ukraine has dried up. The United States has given 115 billion euros in total bilateral aid to Ukraine so far. This dwarfs Germany's 21.3 billion euros and 7.56 billion euros from France. Without the United States, there is absolutely no way that the Europeans can afford to bankroll the war by themselves. For that, they have to borrow money. Or they could raid the 200 billion euros of frozen Russian assets that sit in Europe. Previously, Germany, France, Belgium, and the European Central Bank have opposed an asset raid. The money sits in the vaults of Euroclear, a large financial depository based in Brussels. France and Germany might be on the line for any compensation claims should Russia win in commercial courts. The European Central Bank believes that an asset raid is illegal and would irrevocably damage Europe's reputation as a financial centre. Under normal circumstances, it would be hopping mad for the EU to take such risks. But if they want to continue to support Ukraine, this is the only financial vehicle they have at their disposal. Now that the European Commission has come out with a proposal for unlocking the money, remember yesterday I was saying that the fact that it is now Ursula who's proposing this makes this different from all previous plans, and we see here Wolfgang Munschau making exactly the same point. Now that the European Commission has come out with a proposal for unlocking the money, there is now a good chance that it could happen. And then what? Leaving the complex technical and legal issues aside, the EU will run into a problem very similar to Margaret Thatcher's caricature of socialism. Eventually, they will run out of other people's money. The misjudgment is that the 200 billion euros will tide us, that's to say Europe and Ukraine, over until Donald Trump leaves office, when he will be succeeded by a Democrat who will happily resume providing the lion's share of the funding. Friedrich Merz, the German Chancellor, said recently that the war will end when Russia is economically exhausted. But our sanctions have failed to cripple the Russian economy. Remember the characterization of madness as doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different outcomes? The EU has so far agreed 18 packages of sanctions. A 19th is now being prepared. And then he talks about how the Russian economy obviously has its stresses, but it is certainly nowhere close to collapse. And then he points out that the Russians also, if they have to, are in a position to call upon help from their friends. And he spoke about China, which has far deeper pockets than the Europeans do, and which, if it was to start lending to Russia, which, by the way, I don't think will ever be needed, would certainly enable the Russians to see this process through. And he finishes: the mistaken idea behind Western sanctions is that Russia and China are dependent on Western technology. He then points out that this isn't so, and ultimately he makes the point that misjudgment on this scale and number is what turns regional wars into world wars. Our army of tweeting, war-hungry Western intellectuals, the successors of those who in the First World War cheered the European armies as Europe fought its way to destruction. They leave me in no doubt that there is substantial support for a glorious war, just as there was 100 years ago. Who can argue with any of this? Well, certainly not me, because I've been making all of these points now for 3.5 years. It's time that these commentaries and these facts started to break through into the mainstream, and that the European public was exposed to them. But those who advocate more war still have the initiative firmly in their hands. And it is a worrying fact that at the moment, the only thing that stands between us and it appears to be the President of the United States and his officials, as they try to balance the various priorities and needs of the United States. Well, that is where I finish my program today. There'll be more from me soon. Let me remind you again, you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar and by going to our shop, links under this video. Last but not least, if you like this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.